Hello and welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Robert Barton, Professor Emeritus and former Head of Acting at the University of Oregon. Barton teaches a class called Acting Shakespeare at the U of O and has taught for AHA International in London. He has performed in most of the plays of Shakespeare and has directed half of them. Barton is the author of 3 of the most widely used acting texts in the country: Acting, On Stage and Off, Style for Actors, for which he received the Theatre Association's Best Book Award, and Voice, On Stage and Off. He is the co-author with Annie McGregor of Theatre in Your Life, a new text with a companion play anthology, Life Themes. Robert has been honored as Outstanding Acting Coach by the American College Theatre Festival. He has published numerous articles in scholarly journals, and his regular column, Many Right Ways, appears in each edition of the Voice and Speech Review. Robert, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so glad to have you coming to speak to us for the first time, I believe,
yes,
right?
It is.
I'm going to jump right in and ask you one of the big questions, and I know you've given this a lot of thought. So the question,
okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
The question is, what does theater offer society?
Well, I think theater offers a great deal than most people think. It tends to be perceived as a fairly elitist and exclusive and even a sort of esoteric art form. But I think what theater really gives you is an incredible set of skills to use in life. For example, you train as an actor, and it's not that likely you're going to get a job as an actor. It's the world's largest unemployed profession. But what you will get are these incredible skills. In fact, the employment agency, Snelling & Snelling, has said that they love to place theater majors because in non-theater jobs, because they understand poise, they understand meeting the public, they understand working under pressure, they understand what it is to meet deadlines. Theater really gives you the kind of life skills in a really fun way that are incredibly useful for almost any organization. And so I think it teaches you a great deal about how you impress the world, the kind of impression you make, and how to change it if you don't like it.
I know that in your most recent co-authored textbook, you address a student audience that's very broad, those who might want to consider taking up acting as a profession, but also those who are studying drama, theater as a liberal arts requirement, say, or just for some background. How do you manage that mix of students in your classes, those who want to be practitioners and those who are there just because they're curious?
Well, I think everybody who studies the art needs to study it seriously and with the idea of being professional in the way they practice it, whether it becomes a profession or not. And I think those that are serious majors also can use the life skills. You know, everyone can benefit from learning to act your life better, you know. So I think that it's not a difficult balance at all, because I think the combination of on stage and off is one that everybody can use.
I love that phrase about acting your life better. I think that's a real gem. You were telling me about one of your textbooks, which is now in its 6th edition, I believe. Yeah. And you said every time you re-edit it, you add more information that ties theater to the real world. I believe you said in this latest edition you're adding a section on how handling a job interview is a form of acting. Yeah,
I think with times being how they are, a job interview becomes even more important. And there's always been a section in the book called the Dreaded 13, which are the questions that are always coming up in interviews that tend to throw everyone off, you know. And so that's always been a part of it, but now I'm going into a great detail on refining your technique in a job interview. It's really one of the ultimate offstage acting experiences. You know, of course you have a job interview for an acting job, but you have a job interview for any job. So I just think it's one of those things that at this particular time, and always looking for something new for a new edition, it seemed one of the most relevant editions.
Well, but now I'm really curious. You have to give us a small sample of the Dreaded 13. What's on that notorious list?
Oh, the Dreaded 13 are they're questions that tend to throw people, like, tell me something about yourself. What have you done? Why do you want to be an actor? Why should we hire you? What's special about you? You know, and I should, that's about half of them. I don't remember all of them. But they aren't unique to acting. You know, they tend to come up in other categories. And people tend to be really thrown. Tell me something about myself. Well, what do I say exactly? And really, they're so predictable that you can just rehearse your answers. And you can come up with different answers depending on the mood, the vibe you're getting from the interviewer, that sort of thing, you know. So tell me something about yourself. You have incredible freedom, but ironically, the questions that are the most open tend to inhibit you. So when someone says, tell me about your last job, you need to particularize your answer. So one of the things I always recommend is go right to, my favorite part about the job was, in other words, make it seems incredibly general and open, and what am I going to say? If you can find some specific ways to clone on that answer, then you'll probably do well.
Wow, I think the students who get through this training with you are really well equipped. I'm impressed.
Well, I hope so. Some of them are, yeah.
And in a sense that leads to my next question, which is whether the study of theater has changed over the last generation or so. You are now an emeritus professor. You've seen a lot of students come through over the years. Do you find that the training of actors has changed?
Not really. There will come along and there'll be new methods for teaching voice, for example. There'll be new technologies that are involved. There certainly is more need, I think, for camera training and preparation than there may have been years ago. But we still base most actor training on the Stanislavski system, and it's pretty solid, you know. So I think that in the traditions of, for example, how auditions are conducted and how you prepare your resume, you have your photo, you go in and do 2 contrasting monologues, that kind of thing has remained absolutely constant for years and years.
So the new material that you add to your textbooks, for instance, does it just address current issues of new technologies, or how would you say that your approach in your textbooks has shifted?
Not so much shifted as I'll add something. For example, a couple editions ago, I was realizing that a lot of young actors train and they never have a theater experience at all. They go right into film work. So I felt the need to add a whole section on acting for the camera and a whole section on scale, the way you tone your performance down for a tight close-up, the way you expand it if you're playing, well, let's say Autzen Stadium, you know, and the whole idea that you adjust your performance for the performance space. So it's not just camera versus on stage, but even a small theater versus a large one. And so so kind of each edition I kind of go, what do people not seem to be quite grasping at present, you know? With this new one, for example, the interview technique, I realized that my students, for some reason, they haven't experienced the protocol of interviews. Most of them find it amazing when I suggest writing a follow-up note to thank the interviewer. Which was kind of really standard for many, many years. But because sometimes things kind of leave a generation and yet you go, well, that didn't leave the person that you're auditioning for. That didn't leave the person who might hire you. That's still one of the things that's really appreciated is the follow-up note.
It makes a lot of sense to me that you would have to coach people in those niceties. There's a lot of talk these days about how the handwritten note is more or less dead as a social phenomenon.
Well, and I think that, for example, an email is acceptable, but boy, the handwritten note will really impress in this day and age because so many people omit it altogether.
So looking back, what brought you into theater? How did you end up doing what you do?
Oh, wow. I think I first fell in love with theater because as a child, I had an unfortunate childhood. My parents were divorced very young. There was a lot about real life that wasn't so great. And then I really kind of discovered the theater and went, oh my God, there's a place where you have great lines, you know what to say all the time. Your decision will be dramatic even if it's not the right one. You know, as opposed to real life, which can sometimes be deadly and dull, and people will disappoint you sometimes, not so much by being villains in your life, but by simply not being there for you, you know, that kind of thing. So I think we all play dress up and let's pretend, and I was very into that. And then I realized, whoa, you could do this all the time. You could actually do dress up and let's pretend for a living. And then I discovered, actually someone gave me children's tales from Shakespeare when I was about 10 years old. And I just fell in love with the stories and that sort of thing. You know, there were very few of the actual lines from the plays, but I remember saying to myself, Shakespeare writes fairy tales for grown-ups. It had all the ingredients that I loved from King Arthur and Robin Hood and even the magical elements of like Peter Pan. Those were my favorite stories. And I recognized that this was something that you could have for your entire life. You can have, as I have, you have an association with Shakespeare, and you're constantly involved in these wonderful magical tales with miracles and knights and quests and all of those things. They're profound ideas and beautiful language, but it also is essentially a wonderful way of journeying long ago, far away, you know, and not necessarily being stuck in the present reality.
It sounds like you very successfully drew your own son into this world, too. You gave me a great anecdote before we started filming about his relationship to your office. Would you mind telling that story?
Sure. When he was about 3 years old, I overheard him saying to some of his friends of the same age, "Don't you love to go up to your daddy's office?" And they went, "No." And he says, "Well, don't you like to play with the stuffed animals and the swords and the masks, you know, and the bouncy balls?" And of course, he went through an itinerary of what's in my office, and it was a great reminder of how blessed I am to have a job that requires toys, you know, and to basically be in a profession that, to some extent, is about people reawakening their childhood sense of wonder. That's a lot of what an acting class does for people. They come into it and all of a sudden they learn to play again.
It sounds like you have an awful lot of fun.
Yes, yeah.
On the technical front, I know that you teach certain methods, and you said that there are, in fact, some new techniques around. You yourself are a certified Neuro-Linguistic Programming practitioner, correct?
Yes, I am.
Could you explain how that relates to theater practice?
Well, Neuro-Linguistic Programming was designed to study brilliant communicators. They started out with legendary therapists, Virginia Satir, Fritz Perls, Milton Erickson. The whole idea was, what do great communicators do that the rest of us might be able to learn from and emulate? And so it provides an actor, for example, with a whole way of communicating much better with fellow actors, with costume designers, with directors. You really perceive the world differently after studying neuro-linguistic programming. One of the most famous parts is whether someone is a visual, an auditory, or a kinesthetic learner. And if someone says, "I see what you mean," or "I hear what you say," or "that sounds good," or they said "that feels right," that's probably the way they're perceiving the world at any given moment. So simply understanding that, if someone is responding in a very kinesthetic way, and they're also moving a lot, and they seem to need a lot of contact, you understand a great deal about how to communicate with them. You know, you understand that kinesthetics, for example, need to be touched, they need to be hugged, and they need a lot of reassurance, and they're not going to be patient. They need to get up. One of the reasons we take breaks in class is for the kinesthetics to be able to move around and load in information. So it's a vast system, but it's incredibly useful to theater, I think.
Is it therefore more about how an actor interacts with his or her environment and the people also involved in the production, or is it actually about how that person projects his or her persona?
Well, both of those. I think that the skills in NLP are definitely about rehearsal interaction, but they also provide you, for example, with all different ways to analyze a character. What if I played this character as an extreme visual? What if I made him extremely auditory, you know, and sound? And so it provides a whole new way of rehearsing, a whole new way of perceiving things. It also provides a lot of skills, such as, I mentioned visual, auditory, kinesthetic. If you're someone who has trouble memorizing text, you're a slow study, it probably means you haven't, what I call it, you haven't VAK'd it. You probably aren't memorizing with enough images. You probably aren't memorizing with enough memory of what it feels like to say those words. Because what we know is if you provide information to a student and it has a visual, an auditory, and a kinesthetic component, they'll learn it faster and probably keep it more. So, and all the skills that, such as line memorization, it's a great help.
So that VAKing is the visual, the auditory, and the
Got
kinesthetic. Got
it.
it. Okay.
A lot of lingo. NLP, VAK.
But you actually integrate this into your classroom work and into your
I
directing?
teach a class called NLP for Actors. In fact, I'll be offering that next term. Yeah.
I have to move on to Shakespeare, given that Shakespeare is so central to your concerns, your interests, your passions, your teaching, your theater work. You've developed a concept called the Shakespearean Self.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, my students in acting Shakespeare class create an alter ego for themselves. Somebody who lived in Shakespeare's time, who is a noble, who's responsible for a lot of people. And we do improvs in the court of Elizabeth I, where these Shakespearean selves, representing their people, come to the court and interact in an improvisatory way. And what it provides the students, I believe, is there's a kind of conduit. There's me, my neurotic, frightened contemporary self. There's my Shakespearean self, much braver and more eloquent than I. And then there's the character that I play. And so, and if you can improvise in a Shakespearean context, then you bring all this confidence to when you actually have to do the dialogue. So I think it's a nice kind of segue between you and the character.
You have them act this out very, in a very concrete setting, right? This is part of the capstone experience in your class this term, I believe.
Well, yeah, it's not the main focus of the class, but we go to court 5 times and have a teaching assistant who plays Queen Elizabeth, and everybody gets dressed up in whatever they can come up with from the costume shop, you know, and even wearing a cape does a great deal for a lot of people in terms of empowering and ennobling them, you know, so it is a lot of fun, I think.
One detail of it that I liked a lot was you explained to me that everyone's persona has to include an element of their own name.
Yes.
So
I am Bartonio.
Bartonio.
Yeah, and our John Schmor, our department head, who was actually a student in this class at one time, was Prince Johannes of Schmorovia. So
it gives the students a chance to play with their own identity,
yeah,
but not be restricted by it, I suppose.
Yes.
So how do students today, first decade of the 21st century, how do they respond to Shakespeare? Are they quick to realize the relevance, or do you need to lead them there?
No, they absolutely love Shakespeare, you know, right out of the gate. Now, I think one of the advantages of having the Oregon Shakespeare Festival down the road is that many of my students have experienced pretty high quality Shakespeare, and they've fallen in love with them by the time they come to the university. And that's a great advantage, you know. But there really is no need. I mean, really, once people taste the brilliant words and the complex characters and the magic, you know, Shakespeare just works on them and compels them, and he owns them.
And I, forsooth, in love, I that have been love's whip, very beadle to a humorous side, critic, nay, a night watch constable, a domineering pedant o'er the boy, whom no mortal so magnificent was wimpled, whining, purblind, wayward boy, this senior, junior, giant dwarf, Don Cupid, regent of love rhymes, lord of folded arms. The anointed sovereign of sighs and groans, liege of all loiterers and malcontents, dread prince of plackets, king of codpieces. Oh, oh, my little heart. Am I to be the corporal of his field, and wear his colors like a tumbler's hoop? But I love, I sue, I seek a wife, a woman that is like a German clock, still a-repairing and ever out of frame, and is never going to rise, being watched, but being watched that it may still go right. Nay, to be perjured, which is worst of all, among 3 to love the worst of all. Whitely wanton, velvet brow, 2 pitch balls stuck in her face for eyes. And by heaven, one that will do the deed, though Argus were her unit of God. And I, to sigh for her, to watch for her, to pray for her. Oh, go to, it is a plague. A Cupid hath imposed for my neglect of his almighty dreadful little might. Well, I will love. Right. Sigh, pray, sue, and groan. Some men may love my lady, and some Joan.
You know that corpus inside out and backwards. You've acted it, you've directed it. Do you feel that there are certain plays that are easier to work with today in contemporary society than others?
Well, I think that the most difficult plays are the ones that are rarely produced. I, for example, was working for a Shakespeare festival as they were finishing up the canon. So I got the great privilege to act in Timon of Athens and Pericles and Henry VIII and Cymbeline, the ones that are never done. And there's a reason why they're not done that often. I mean, they're very challenging in terms of finding the arc of a character, you know, in terms of really developing, in terms of handling the archaic language. Whereas you think of, one of my students was asking me the other day, what was the most difficult role you ever played? Was it Hamlet? And I went, well, not really, because Hamlet is so brilliantly written. It has such a clear arc, and he has these wonderful 6 soliloquies. You know, I mean, it's really so much of it is there. You know, it's so strong that you, the actor, don't have to do that much to fill it in.
I saw the production of Henry VIII at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival this year, which was a complete revelation to me. I'd never read it, I'd never seen it, I knew nothing about it. It takes a bold producer, a bold director to put something like that on the stage.
Well, and you know, it's quite wonderful to be in them because the audience comes like to a new play. They don't come in with all these associations or all the famous actors they've seen in the role. They don't know how it's going to end. And so there's a kind of excitement that is very different from when they're coming back again to see Romeo and Juliet or As You Like It or one of their faves, you know.
Speaking of the faves, you have a long and very, very rich history with Hamlet.
Yes, I do.
You yourself have played Hamlet, and I believe you have a family connection to the play as well.
Yes, my son has actually played Hamlet twice already, and he's just turned 23. So that's quite remarkable, and what a great experience for him. And in one of those productions, I was Hamlet the Elder, the ghost of his father. So it's a really kind of interesting idea. How many Hamlets are sons of former Hamlets, and how many fathers and sons have played that particular father and son. So it's been a very rich experience for both of us.
How did it influence your understanding of that play? Did it make any difference in your relationship to it?
How did what?
The acting this, being in the same production with your son.
Oh, I don't know as it changed my perception of the play. I'd had so much experience with it over the years. And of course I was more enthralled with just watching his work, you know.
So you got to watch it from close up.
Yeah.
One of the things that's remarkable about your profile, I think, Robert, is that you have approached the stage and the field of acting from just about every possible dimension. You've published actively in scholarly journals. You are a director, you are an actor, you are a teacher. Have you consciously kept all of those different approaches to the field alive at the same time?
I don't think there was a deliberate plan on my part to do that, but I think to write about the art form and not practice it seems to me to not write about it with heart and soul. You know, in most of my writing came along with, I'm doing it. There doesn't seem to be anything written about how to do this. I guess I better do that. But I would have to discover it by participating in theater, I think, in order to find what seemed to need to be written.
Can you say the inverse of that as well, that in order to be a good actor you need to know some theater history or you need to understand technique?
Well, I like to believe that. I like to persuade my students that, but what I've found in terms of good actors is there's absolutely no rule at all. Some of the people who prepare the hardest and do the most research and write the best character analysis, their performances come up short. Other people don't do any of that and they're brilliant. You know, it's really an elusive art form as far as what truly makes people excel.
Something that struck me looking at your most recent textbook, which you co-authored, is how very rich that textbook is and how much research it must have taken you. Did you have any help figuring out the sections on theater across the world, ancient Greek theater, medieval theater, theater in different cultures. Were you and your co-author doing all that work?
Well, we were, and it was a great challenge for us, the whole multicultural aspect of the text, and a great enlightenment for me to learn about African theater and to really go deeply into Asian theater. The joke as we were writing is that Annie and I were two of the whitest, perhaps two of the blondest authors, you know, that had ever tackled world theater. And so for us it was incredibly enlightening and exciting. We also had the advantage, she works at Penn State, which has a theater faculty of 20-some. So they have the African theater faculty, they have the Asian theater I mean, there's a whole resource that certainly wouldn't have been available to me here in our department, our little small department of 7 faculty.
So you drew on colleagues and,
yes.
and you knew where to find your sources.
Yes.
So Robert, what do you have going at the moment, apart from this class, the Shakespeare class that is currently coming towards the end of a term? Do you have anything else in the works? Are you directing? Are you acting?
No, but I'm very much involved with the British publishing company Routledge has purchased the right to voice on stage and off from McGraw-Hill, and they're producing a whole new edition of it. They do the same thing with a book of mine called Style for Actors. They purchased it from Cengage, and they've also commissioned me to write an NLP for Actors book. So I have a number of things in the works. I'm working on a book on acting comedy, and also editing one called The Craft of Comedy. So as I kind of segue from not spending so much time in Villard Hall in the theater department, I have a whole lot of new writing projects and commitments lined up.
That's a long list of books you're working on.
Yes, it is.
Do you have a particular preference for comedy, by the way? Or were you just asked to produce something
Actually,
on which there's a gap?
Like a lot of my works just kind of come out of being asked to do it. In this case, it was a very gifted student who did her dissertation on acting comedy and asked me to co-author the text, and we realized there was no definitive book on acting comedy, particularly one that combines the theory as well as the practice. And so sometimes it's either very, very mental, or it's very much, here's how you do a pratfall, you know, here's how you do a double take, and that sort of thing. And so this project just seemed like, once again, it doesn't seem like it was missing. It's not out there, so let's do it.
I'm hoping to see some of that when I come and visit the showcase for your Shakespeare class at the end of the term. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you for coming, Robert. It's been great to talk to you.
It's been my pleasure.
We've been speaking with Professor Robert Barton, Professor Emeritus and former head of